Hi, I'm Don Davidson. I'm veterinarian with Cooper Farms. I've been there about 5 years, originally from Ohio, but returned 5 years ago from out west. Worked for a packing company out of Los Angeles and managed sows in 4 states in the west and came back to Ohio. So Glenn had asked me, last year I talked about the biosecurity with manure application, and he'd asked me to talk about that and then how that applies to African swine fever. I think most people have heard about African swine fever, so we'll get into that. A lot of the presentation is what I gave a year ago on PRRS and PD, but I'll throw in there the issues with African swine fever, how that can relate to biosecurity practices. But the simple thing is, if you're doing everything to control PRRS and PD and other diseases on your farm, you're going to control African swine fever. Just some biosecurity facts. PRRS costs the U.S. industry anywhere between $640 million to $1 billion a year is what it costs in the swine industry. African swine fever, if it gets in the U.S., is expected to cost the swine industry $8 billion. Not only from the losses of animals, but the trade markets will shut down. So we're pretty concerned about it. The objective of biosecurity is to prevent disease from spreading from farm to farm, animal to animal, animal to human, and human to animal. Number one way disease spreads is animal to animal, and number two is people to animal, animal to people. It's not by air, but everybody, including our own people, like to blame things on. Clean equipment is important. Limit where vehicles go and equipment goes. Equipment cleaning is not just washing down with water. It's using a detergent, a soap, and hopefully a disinfectant. If you're only going to use one, we'd rather see you use the detergent because it'll kill 95% of the bugs. The disinfectants typically won't work if there's organic material there. So if you're only going to use one, you'd be better off using the soap or good detergent. And disinfectants can't eliminate disease, especially if there's organic material there. Some of the things with biosecurity here, we talk a lot about downtime. That's just the amount of time that it's an arbitrary number. You'll hear people say 48 hours, 72 hours, 3 nights. That's typically based on the most common diseases that we deal with that you can transfer on equipment or yourselves. So that's what downtime is. That allows a lot of those pathogens, if they're on the equipment or yourself, to die in that amount of time. Indirect contact, that's the kind of contact we're concerned when especially with manure application. That's from the people and equipment coming in contact with the animals in the barn. The other types of indirect contact are rodents, birds, insects. Then just even equipment in the farm, semen coolers, lunch pails, tools, supplies like that go between farms. Vehicles, we try to keep vehicles away from the farm, including our own employees. We put some distance in there because we can't control where their vehicles leave or go to when they leave the farm, so keep those away. Vehicles are going to different farms. We have actually what we call biosecurity centers where we have truck washes or vehicle washes that they go through and disinfect. And if vehicles are on lagoons, then they're not allowed in contact with the farms. Talk about how long these diseases can survive, and that's really, hopefully that makes an impact because they can live a long time. This is the perfect time of year for disease. Disease love cold weather. We see PRRS mostly when we have issues with PRRS. I see it coming back here, two situations in the wintertime like this, and then when you apply manure, either in late fall or early spring when there's a lot of manure activity on the roads. And we're in a pretty dense livestock area, so we see it associated with those activities and the weather. PD, that's a coronavirus, which we're all pretty familiar with from China. This is a different coronavirus, and it came around in the fall of 2018, but it can live up to 9 months in lagoon water. We had a farm in the Front Range of Colorado, and we got PD in February, And we have open air lagoons in the Front Range of Colorado. It's pretty hot in the summer and it's very dry. And we found PED in those lagoons in August, so it can live a long time. PRRS can live up to 11 days, salmonella, mycoplasma. They can all survive in manure. There again, PED, 9 months. This was put together by Dr. Root of Ohio State. PRRS, the same deals there. African swine fever is a problem. It loves cold weather. It loves cold things. It loves raw pork. There was a study on African swine fever and frozen pork that lived up 1,000 days in frozen pork. And 1,000 days is because that's when they stopped the study. So essentially, it can live forever in frozen pork. So that's why we have to be careful. I'll talk a little bit about African swine fever. It comes from Africa. It's spread by blood-sucking ticks in Africa, but that's not how it's spreading into commercial operations. There's several strains. The one that's circulating now in the world is really pathogenic, up to 100% mortality. This here says it's been eradicated in the U.S. I don't know that it's ever been in the U.S., so I don't know how it can be eradicated if it's never been here. But in 2018 in August, African swine fever is reported in China. It's been in other countries. Spain had it several years ago and they eliminated it. Russia's had it, but it made its way into China, and just because of how China operates and things like that, this thing is really blown up. China has 40 million sows. They have half the world's population of sows. U.S. has about 6.3 million sows, and we're in the top 5. Maybe 2 or 3 behind China. So they have half the world's pig population. Right now, it's estimated that it's taken out 10% up to 50% of their sows. Information's kind of really not being reported that I'm seeing anymore, but people that I know have been over there say it's at the higher end of that, not the lower end. Back to that, half of China's sows were still raised in backyards. And it took out 7 million sows just in people with pigs in their backyard. And again, put that in relation. We have 6 million sows in the U.S., so it's a big deal. It's now throughout all of China, most Asian countries. How it's moving, it's direct, by pig to pig. Garbage, feeding garbage is a big problem. They feed a lot of garbage in China. That moves it, so dead pigs end up in the garbage, and the garbage is fed to healthy pigs. That's how it's moving. And contaminated feed. That's getting a lot of press in the U.S. right now, but if you listen to the people that actually work with African swine fever, it's probably going to get here by people traveling and pork products coming in luggage and things like that, or smuggled in. It's pretty common that there's a lot of pork cultural type products that are smuggled in through passengers. And so feed really is probably about the third risk factor. And just most of our vitamins all come from China. After the PED break in 2018, those places have really upped their biosecurity. There's still risks there. Probably the biggest risk you hear on feed coming from China is organic soybean meal. Apparently China's a marketer of organic soybean meal, so that's a problem. I don't think a lot of that gets here. And then fomites, that's what we talk about, vehicles and equipment. Those are important things, and that's how this thing really moved throughout China. It's really a resistant virus. It can live several days, months in dirty pens, 18 months in the pig's blood. Over 140 days in some pork products. If it's not cooked, it can survive. By the way, doesn't cause any problems in people. It's not a problem. And years in frozen carcasses. So people smuggling products over and put it in your freezer and get it out 3 years from now, it can still be infected. This is kind of just the most recent countries where African swine fever is. And most of the Asian countries have it today. Russia had it, Western Europe, and it's moving a little bit. The scenario is a little different in Asia versus European countries. In the European countries, there's a lot of wild boar hunting, and it's a big deal. So it's mostly moving into wild boar population. And how that's risky is in the wintertime, if a wild boar well, first of all, people hunting it and taking them home. The other problem is if wild boars become infected and they die and it's winter and it's frozen, well, that thing is alive and other wild pigs eat it and it's moving. It's in Poland now, and Germany's actually put up fences to try to limit the wild boar population from coming into Germany. Germany's a pretty big pig production country, and you know how pigs and fences are, so that's not working too well, was what I'm hearing. U.S., this is what they really think the risk is, airports, and these are 5 airports where they think it's high risk of African swine fever coming in the United States. I made a statement a couple months ago, got me in trouble, but I didn't make the statement. I just repeated it from Dave Pyburn, who's a veterinarian, National Pork Board, made the comment that it's probably already made its way to the U.S. It just hasn't made its way to a pig with the amount of pork products that are smuggled. And the USDA, they've increased inspectors. Most people, you know, I don't know if you traveled internationally, they either don't fill out the inspection forms because they don't want the hassle to hang up at the airport, or a lot of the inspectors don't care. But they've really upstepped both inspectors, and then they use beagles, actually. They call them the Beagle Brigade. They put in a lot more beagles into sniffing luggage, and actually they do confiscate a lot of product. It's in the thousands of pounds. A question was asked as well, have you found it here in the U.S. yet? According to Dave Pyburn, USDA does not test it. They destroy it immediately. And asked, well, why don't they test it? Aren't they curious as well? If they test it, then they got to report it, and then there goes our market. So I don't know if they do or not, but he says they don't test it. Talk a little bit back on PRRS. Dr. Rudo at Ohio State, and this is how most diseases spread. The number one reason is networks, and that's indirect. We talked about indirect transmission, people and equipment. Land features, meaning flat land, no trees, it'll move more. Seasonality, more in the colder months, but these diseases live year-round, but they survive longer in the colder months. It's not necessarily that they aren't here in the summers, it's that they don't live as well. The best disinfectant there is the sunshine. They don't live very well in the summer. And area spread, and then that's the deal with the aerosol. Her data says there's no evidence of area spread of PRRS. And when they did a lot of these trials and they talked about aerial spread, it can happen, but it's like the perfect storm of events that have to happen for aerial spread. So we tried to blame things we can't control when it's really the things we can control. And this just, you don't have to understand all this, but it just to make a point, it doesn't take a lot of particles, and all diseases have different amounts it takes to infect you. 1 milliliter of PRRS blood can have 10 billion virus particles in there. And it only takes 100 particles by a needle to infect a pig. So you can imagine 1 milliliter of piglet blood can infect 10 million sows. So it doesn't take a lot. And PD, the diarrhea disease, the coronavirus, they said is even worse. They said if you can imagine the eraser on the end of a number 2 pencil, there can be enough PD virus in there to infect every pig in the United States. So it doesn't take a lot, and that's what's important. It's not just visibly clean, it's got to be beyond that. So this just tells you it doesn't take a lot of these viruses to cause diseases. This research was done by Scott D. Pipestone, kind of the same thing. Talk about in the pits, lived up to 14 days, pumping equipment, agitator hoses, people's clothing, and then he does say it can be aerosolized over short distances, 10 feet, and longer distance if it's applying it. And it can be, but it's got to be a lot of virus particles in there, and it's got to hit things right. So that's where the aerosol is there, but it's not the biggie. When we talk to people about pumping manure, I think Glenn asked me to do this is because a lot of times the manure pumpers get blamed for spreading diseases, and I don't blame them. I blame our own growers. That's their job, and you can't ask them to to clean and disinfect, and I would think it'd be damn near impossible to clean some of the and disinfect those equipment if you're going from one site to the next overnight. So it's got to be good communication and just some good practices. We ask that the equipment show up clean. We use a biosecurity pyramid we talk about, like your farms that have the highest value animals. You want longer downtime for them, so our boar stud, we got 130 boars that's responsible for breeding 28,000 sows. So 130 boars go down, that's a big deal versus a finishing site that goes down. And then where the manure is being applied, we try to be good stewards to our neighbors. If we're applying manure to a neighbor that's not our pigs and it's got PRRS, we don't do that, or we stay away from their barns. When I talked about a lot of PRRS that we see during manure application, because there's a lot of vehicles on the road and a lot of people, you're going to the restaurant or the hardware store or whatever, or your truck tires are picking that up, you're coming in contact with that. If you're walking in your barn and not changing your clothes or putting your boots or scrubbing them, you can carry that in the barn, and that's happened. And the PED outbreak that took place in 2018 in Iowa, which is between Iowa and North Carolina, have the most pigs in the U.S. They found PED virus in all these convenience stores when they went around and tested them, so it's everywhere. This biosecurity pyramid, that's what we say is our most valuable animals, so they have the biggest impact, and then we go down and our disease farms at the bottom. So if you're applying manure or going to different sites, you always want to start with your cleanest site first and go down the pyramid and not up the pyramid. Go to your less risky sites first and then your most risky sites last. The biosecurity, when pumping manure, it's a necessary activity. We're not going to ask you to stop, and we don't. We have to do it. Communication is important. That's probably the most important thing. And then we talk about a line of separation. That's where we create this barrier. Sometimes it's invisible, or we might mark it, where if we have an applicator coming to the site that he can't cross that line of separation. Typically around our sow farms, that's several feet beyond the barn, not the barn door, but beyond the barn. So we typically own some equipment where we take it from the barn to several feet out, and then the applicator takes it from there. Most of the issues I come up with aren't manure applicators going in barns. Most of the time they don't have any reason to go in a barn. It's our own growers working with the manure applicator than walking in those barns. So I try to educate our growers more than the manure applicators, is that they got to do what they need to do, that they're not carrying that viruses back into the barn. So you shouldn't, if you're a manure applicator, you shouldn't go in the barn. If you're a grower, you shouldn't let them in the barn. If it's necessary, recognize your risk and make sure you take the precautions if they have to go in that barn. Again, communication is important. Meet the downtime requirements. Know the health status of your farms. For example, we got a lot of our sow farms are 2,700. A PRRS in a sow farm typically is $1 million hit. So some of these little practices we ask is worth not getting $1 million hit on a sow farm. Where they've been previously, what's the health status of those farms? When you show up, an applicator shows up, what is your line of separation? Where can they move and contact? Maybe they are going right to the barn and putting a hose in and through the outside. Well, if that's the way it has to be done, that's the way it has to be done. Just recognize that and make sure you take the proper precautions. I put a lot of pigs in barns that had PED and PRRS in the previous cycle, and I know it's in that pit, but as long as it doesn't come back up through that slat, it's not going to affect that pig. And I tell people that as long as those people stay outside that door and that manure doesn't come up through that slat, we're okay. I consider everything outside that barn door infected, but I'm not worried about it if we're doing what we need to be doing. And then where is the manure being hauled? This I'm going to do this real quick. It's our genetic company. They actually, give a lot more detail on biosecurity practices of hauling manure. This is our specific practices for our nursery and finisher operations. So all of our sow farms are shower in. All the people shower in, and we provide the clothing on the inside. That doesn't happen on the nursery and finishers. Most of those are contract growers, so there's no shower. Most of them would use what we hope they use is what we call the Danish system. Works very well, where they actually have clothing on the inside that they're putting coveralls or changing their boots. That's the Danish system. It actually works very well if you do it right, but you can't have those outside the barn. They have to be inside the barn because if they're outside, they can become contaminated. We let the applicators know where they can set up. We provide some of the equipment for the applicators, and we just think that's worth our investment to reduce $1 million hit to a sow farm. So we provide some of the equipment. They don't go into the barn. We don't allow any of their equipment into the barn. If they agitate the pit, we're careful that it's not splashing up through the slats. On our high health farms, we may ask those applicators to sit down for a month. Well, if you're an applicator, and that's your business, you can't do that. Well, what I tell you is, if it's worth that to us, we just got to pay for it. You got to pay them to do that. And if it's a bore stud that's pretty valuable, then you pay to have that done. Or we try to do other things we do. One of our applicators does a lot of dairy, so hopefully there's a dilution effect if he's been to some other pig farm in between dairies that is diluting whatever was in there. We re-clean the equipment. It sits on our site. We re-disinfect it. So we go through a lot of steps, and since I've been here, going in my 6 years, we have people that pump our sow farms that have never had a disease from an applicator come back to our sow farms. The problems we've had been our own people. So this stuff does work. Just kind of finalizing here, there's 2 steps, cleaning and disinfection. Cleaning is removing the organic debris, the biofilm. That's where your detergent is effective, high pressure, hot water, and then you're disinfecting afterwards. A lot of other failures we see is disinfectants don't work in the presence of organic material. So if you're applying disinfectant on manure, you're wasting your time and your money. A lot of the other issues that come up with disinfectants is there's dumping. There are rates you need to apply. You need to read the label and apply it at the right rates. That's really important, and that's abused a lot. And the other thing, there's contact time for disinfectants. If you have a foot bath at the beginning of your door of your barn, first of all, if it's dirty, it's actually more risk than it's helping. You might as well just stop doing it. But if it's clean and you have disinfectant in there and it's at the right rate, and you step in your barn immediately, you're not doing anything. Most of these disinfectants require 10 minutes of contact time to kill anything. So just realize you potentially still are carrying something in there if you're not allowing what they call contact time with that disinfectant. This last few, just some examples. We have our own hoses and some of our own pumps that we take out to the applicator that sits out by a designated road that our employees aren't allowed on, and that's how we transfer it from the barn to the applicator. Final considerations, biosecurity does work. When you're applying manure or whatever, call before entering, ask about farm-specific rules, follow directions, be clean, disinfect and communicate when you leave, and that's it. So I don't know if anybody has any questions.
What questions do we have for the doc? $8 billion, that'd be a pretty big hit to pork industry and the United States economy in general. Okay, with that, yes, right here.
I'm so sorry, you have a vaccine.
USDA researchers actually developed a vaccine that's pretty effective, but it's like the coronavirus you hear now. It's going to take a year and a half to get. China claims they have a vaccine that's working, but USDA does have one. Looks pretty damn promising, but to get it approved, manufacturing, get it distributed, we're saying a year to year and a half. So.